Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today we're speaking with Professor Pat Barron about dollar hegemony and reserve currencies. Professor Barron is a private consultant to the banking industry and teaches an introductory course in Austrian economics at the University of Iowa. He teaches bank management simulation at the Graduate School of Banking at the University of Wisconsin and has delivered numerous presentations at the European Parliament. You can follow his work at patrickbarron.blogspot.com. For more information, see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/dollar-hegemony. Professor Barron, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
So let's start off with simple definitions. What is dollar
Hegemony?
Well, it goes back to toward the end of World War II at the Bretton Woods Conference. And the history of this is that the U.S. was the arsenal of democracy in World War II, and England and the other Allied powers had been at war with the Axis for 2 years before we got into the war. So we were actually supplying war material to the Allied powers and getting paid in gold. And the U.S. economy during the war did much better than any of the other belligerents, except for Pearl Harbor. Our mainland was never really attacked in anything except maybe a tiny little pinprick. I think there were a couple of shellings on the East Coast, but that was about it. So our industrial capacity remained intact, and at the end of the war, the United States owned the lion's share of the world's gold that was held in central banks. So the Bretton Woods Conference that was held in 1944, of all the Allied powers, and victory was pretty much assumed to be on the table at that time, said that the U.S. dollar, for international exchange purposes among central banks, the dollar would be considered the same as gold at $35 an ounce. So the dollar and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, was established at the same Bretton Woods Conference for the express purpose of making sure that the United States did not just print dollars, because our other trading partners were going to be accepting dollars for settlement of trade as if the dollars were worth a dollar was worth 1/35th of an ounce of gold. Well, you can see that if the United States just printed dollars, it would be the same as sort of printing gold. Well, the IMF did not do its job, and the other powers really didn't complain about this, but from the very beginning, the United States started printing dollars. And so what this really meant was that the United States was buying the output of the rest of the world with counterfeit money, so to speak. This is really when you get down to it, this is really what happened. Well, this went along sort of swimmingly throughout the 50s and into the 60s until the French got a new president in 1958 named Charles de Gaulle. And despite what many Americans have been led to believe, Charles de Gaulle was one of the greatest men of the 20th century. He was not only a statesman and a noted general, but he was also an Austrian economist. And Jacques Ruff, who's also an Austrian economist, was his finance minister. And Ruff told de Gaulle that it looked like the United States was inflating its currency, and dollars were building up in the Bank of France. And this was getting to be quite a problem because the Bank of France was saying, well, this is the same as gold. And Jacques Ruff was saying, well, I don't think it's the same as gold. It's not really gold, it's just dollars. So in the late 60s, de Gaulle instructed Jacques Ruff, running the Bank of France, to cash in 80% of France's dollar reserve for gold. Well, this started a run on U.S. gold reserves because the rest of the world said, well, if the French are doing this, and the French probably know as much about international finance as anybody, if the French are doing this, we better cash in our dollars for gold. So dollars have been building up all over the world. And this started to run on the dollar that culminated in 1971 when our gold reserves got so low that the United States was faced with a crisis. If it continued to redeem gold at $35 an ounce, in other words, if a foreign bank gave the Fed $35, the Fed was obligated to give it an ounce of gold. Well, if the Fed kept doing it, that it was going to run out of gold. So at that point, the U.S. was faced with a choice. It could have revalued. It could have said, in other words, it could have revalued the dollar and devalued the dollar. It could have said, well, the dollar is not worth $35 an ounce. It's going to take $70 an ounce or $100 an ounce or $200 an ounce, whatever that is. I actually did some calculations at one time. And in order for the Fed to redeem all of the outstanding dollars in foreign central banks and not run out of gold, it would have had to value the dollar at $400 an ounce in 1971. Well, instead, President Richard Nixon famously or infamously took the U.S. off the gold standard. He just says, we're just not going to redeem dollars for gold anymore. We are just going to keep our gold, and you've got dollars, sort of ha-ha. You know, you were suckers. You took our dollars and gave us your valuable product, and now we've got your product and you've got our dollars. So what? Well, the U.S. actually got away with this because, the U.S. was the predominant world power at the time. We still are, supposedly, but even in 1971, we were definitely, the predominant world power economically and especially militarily. And I think this is why the U.S. got away with printing dollars, was because our European allies were dependent upon us pretty much for defending them against the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was pretty hostile at this time. They had 50,000 tanks on the eastern border of NATO, and were pretty threatening to Berlin and to our other allies in Iran and into Greece. So the rest of the world pretty much went along with us, and so then that's how we came to have the dollar being the hegemon world currency. And ever since 1971, instead of sort of learning our lesson and not printing dollars, we just went the opposite direction and said, well, gee, now we can print dollars as much as we want because no one's going to try to redeem them for gold, and everybody's sort of kowtowing to us, and we're just going to print dollars. So that's why the U.S. dollar it has been the world, what's called the world reserve currency for many decades now, although that is being challenged around the world by other currencies, namely the yuan. So this is how the dollar has gotten to become a hegemon. Dollars have built up in the central banks massively all over the world. The Chinese and the Japanese each own over $1 trillion of our treasury bills. In other words, when they get dollars in trade, they don't just stack them up in their vault. They actually buy a treasury bill, so they get a little bit of interest on the money, but it's the same thing. So they have all these treasury bills that are building up. They're dollar denominated. They're building up in their vault, so to speak. And now, what can they do with them? If they try to cash them in for American product, it would cause massive inflation in the U.S. And probably a devaluation of the dollar. So these dollars that they have been accepting for decades are sort of depreciating in their vault, so to speak, right now. And so that's the history of the dollar as the world hegemon. And in my opinion, it's right now slowly coming to an end, and who knows, it may rapidly come to an end in the next few years.
Okay, so in a little bit here, we'll go into what this has meant since 1971 and how this might come to an end and what might replace it. But I want to just take a step back. You mentioned the term reserve currency in there. You mentioned that the dollar is the world reserve currency. And I'm guessing some of our listeners are familiar with that term and a lot of them aren't. But so can you go into a little bit of where that term comes from and what it used to mean and what it means now in relation to its former meanings?
Certainly. The modern world's sort of first formal reserve currency was the British pound. In other words, gold was always the ultimate reserve. Physical bars of gold, physical ounces of gold trade was settled in gold. So if the British bought more French goods than the French sold to the British, then the British would have to pay for those. That net difference, and that net difference would be they would pay for it in gold. And for a long time, even into World War II, gold was actually shipped around the world. Periodically, a ship would leave England and go to France, or vice versa, or to America, and the gold would physically be shipped to the central banks. Well, the British maintained their pound in relationship of the pound to an ounce of gold pretty religiously for a long time. And so traders and central banks start saying, well, we're just going to stack up our British pounds because we trust the Bank of England will redeem these pounds for gold at any time that we present them and demand our gold. So if we have 1 million pounds in our vault, that's the same as X number of ounces of gold. And therefore, if we want to now buy, let's say we want to buy Italian goods, we're the French and we have pounds in our vault, and we want to buy Italian goods, instead of shipping the Italians gold, we'll ship them pound sterling. Or we'll just change who owns the pounds in a bank account at a French bank. So this made trade much smoother, a little less risky from a standpoint of actually transporting the gold itself. You can imagine how, this is a little bit risky just actually putting gold bullion on the ship. Ships sink, gold gets robbed, pilfered, and that kind of thing. So in that whole idea, that whole concept of a world reserve currency actually goes back to the idea of gold being the reserve, and then some currency of a major power, of a major central bank, being viewed as almost but not quite the same as gold. So therefore it was the same as having a reserve of gold if you had a reserve of pound sterling, or in the case of the United States after Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944, if they had a reserve of dollars. So that, and even today, the United States, that whole idea of it as a reserve has sort of morphed into something that isn't quite this, is not the same as you can exchange your dollars for gold at the Fed. What it means now is that most trade in the world is actually just denominated in dollars, because most central banks in the world have large stacks of dollars. It's handy for international traders to value their goods that are traded internationally in dollars. So the most famous, of course, is the petrodollar, meaning that the oil from the Middle East or wherever in the world is actually quoted in dollar terms, and people buy and sell oil in dollars and rather than in some other currency. So the United States today, statistically, at one time the United States dollar represented approximately 80% of all the reserves of the central banks. In other words, let's say the Central Bank of Japan had reserves of different currencies. It had dollars, it had some pound sterling, it may have had French francs before the euro came in, today it might have euros, it might have yuan. At one time, the dollar represented 80% of the reserves of all the central banks of the world. Well, today that's down to 60%. So you can see that gradually the central banks are replacing dollars with other denominations, other reserves. And especially the yuan is the one that seems to be the up-and-coming currency, because the Chinese economy was reformed a few decades ago. The Chinese have transformed their economy pretty much into a capitalist economy, or much more of a capitalist economy. So they're concomitant with that is that their currency has strengthened quite a bit. And the Chinese seem to be more understanding of the true importance of gold. So the Chinese have been hoarding gold. We don't know how much, because they're pretty secretive about it, but they do not let any of the gold that is mined in China itself leave the country, and they have been buying lots of gold. They still don't have nearly as much gold as the United States, according to official statistics, if we really do have it. There's a question about that. Nevertheless, there is a feeling that at some point the Chinese might do something where they say, well, the yuan is now backed by gold, or it's backed in maybe it's fractionally backed by gold at 20% or 40% or something. And then the whole world would not demand to hold dollars as much. They would want to hold yuan. And if the world did not demand to hold dollars, if demand for dollars at central banks dropped, then those dollars would start to flow back to the United States, and that would cause inflation in this country. So that's sort of the thumbnail sketch of the history of what a reserve currency is and how it's used.
Could you go back just for a little bit? You were talking about the Bretton Woods Agreement, and if you could explain a little bit how the end of that agreement and the closing of the gold window, what was really the fallout from that, and how did other countries react? I know you talked about it briefly, but could you go in a bit more detail? Well,
after the French started redeeming their dollar reserves for gold in the mid-'60s, mid to late 60s, then other central banks of the world started doing the same thing. So if you think of it this way, that the United States at the Bretton Woods Conference had signed a solemn treaty that was going to be enforced by the International Monetary Fund, that it would not issue dollars, any additional dollars in excess of its gold holdings at $35 an ounce. So let's just say our money supply was at a certain level. The only way we could increase our money supply would have been if the United States got more gold. So yeah, the United States could have gotten gold through trading. If our gold reserves went up, then we could have issued more dollars at $35 an ounce to maintain that $35 per ounce parity. But we just printed dollars. We just printed them. We printed them, or we book entries, the same thing. So there were more dollars out awash in the world than there was gold to back it at the official rate of $35 an ounce. And this is what finally the French were the first ones to really sort of call the world's attention to this problem. So then it's starting in around in the late 60s and culminating again in late 1971, central banks started just turning in their dollars for gold. And our gold reserves started going down and down, and there were more dollars in the world than we had gold to back it up. So, the last guy that comes in the door with his $35, there's not going to be any gold left. Then he's left holding the bag. Now, this was not a good thing, and our trading partners were not happy about it. And they were definitely not happy that the United States decided to go off the gold standard and, in effect, just sort of thumb our nose at our trading partners and saying, we're just not going to redeem your dollars for gold. We are reneging on our solemn treaty that we signed at Bretton Woods. But the geopolitical circumstances at the time meant that the United States could get away with it for a while, and we've sort of gotten away with it for quite a long time. And again, mainly this was because the dollar was still worth something. The other currencies of the world were not seen as being equal to the task of being used as a reserve currency. In my humble opinion, if the Germans had maintained the Deutschmark and not turned it in for euros in the 1990s, I think today that the Deutschmark would probably be very close to being as powerful as the United States dollar. But the Germans didn't. They turned in their Deutschmarks for euros, and now they're suffering the same problems as the rest of Europe. But this is sort of it in a nutshell. It has allowed the United States to, if you can think of it as a counterfeiter does. If a counterfeiter just counterfeits money in the basement, in his basement, and runs some dollars off the printing press, he is really exchanging pieces of paper for valuable goods and services. Well, that's pretty much what the United States is doing. But the rest of the world's doing the same thing. The Japanese are printing yen. Even the Chinese are printing yuan. The Europeans are printing euros. So the world's central banks have all gone kind of crazy with this, they're printing their currency and then putting it into circulation through their central bank open market operations. And so the world is sort of awash in all kinds of currencies. And so today we're faced with a situation where the world still has more confidence in the dollar than it does in just about any other currency, but that confidence is starting to fray at the edges. And once a currency loses confidence, then it can quickly lose all confidence. And then there would be, as I said before, there would be no reason for central banks in the world to hold dollars. People would not want to hold dollars. They'd want to turn them in for anything that they can get that's a real good or service in the United States, and this would cause inflation in the United States, pretty massive inflation. So that's where we are right now, and that's sort of what the history has been since 1971. But in my opinion, that sort of dollar hegemony of international trade has been coming to an end for some time, and I think it's going to probably start accelerating here at some time in the future.
So what role has dollar hegemony played in regards to U.S. foreign policy, and how have we seen the U.S. military sort of going around the world holding up and propping up the dollar?
Oh, that is a wonderful observation. I mean, a wonderful question. By the rest of the world allowing us to print those dollars without any kind of check on it, it has allowed us to expand a military empire. That's all there is to it. If the dollar had been if we had kept the dollar tied to gold, then the United States definitely would not have been running around the world propping up corrupt regimes or waging wars where we have no interest in going, no real national interest, and no real understanding of what's going on. But the dollar has allowed us, again, to do this because the rest of the world has accepted the dollar for real goods and services. If the dollar had to be strong, if we could only fight a war, if we had to tax the American people to do it, then we would have quickly come to our senses and actually viewed things realistically and decided, is a war in Afghanistan, is a war in Iraq, Syria, Libya now, you name it, are these wars really in the national interest and are they worth taxing the American people for? But if you can just print money, then you can have this hidden tax of inflation. So you inflate the money supply and people don't realize what's going on. Their taxes don't go up. Maybe some politicians even say we're going to expand the war and we're going to have a tax cut. Well, that's frankly impossible if you have a sound currency. But if you're just printing the stuff, you can play God for a long time, and you can play that you're a modern-day Caesar for a long time until the whole thing collapses. So there is definitely a link between America's military empire. I understand, I think Ron Paul has said that the United States has over 700 military installations of some kind around the world. That we've just been able to expand this military empire. We willy-nilly just bomb people wherever we think we can bomb them. And we feel that we want to bomb them. Very expensive operation, and frankly, there's been no declaration of war that I've seen come out of Congress for any of this. So being able to print money has allowed the United States to conduct a very irresponsible foreign policy and to intervene all around the world. And again, I think that the rest of the world is getting fed up with all this, and they aren't going to stand for it for much longer. But it's been the unsound money that has allowed us to do that. That's a great question.
And what are some other consequences of this
hegemony
that might not have been immediately apparent? Are there any cultural effects?
Well, definitely the United States has been living, our lifestyle, our standard of living has been higher than it would have been. If you just think of it this way, that I understand that there are $5 trillion held in central banks around the world. One trillion of it is in Japan, 1 trillion of it in China, and then the rest of the other 3 trillion are scattered in other central banks at lower amounts. Well, this just means that we have been running a balance of payments deficit, meaning that we have been importing more than we're exporting, and we're paying for it by printing money. So if we're importing goods, that means that we're importing something real. We're importing automobiles from China. We're importing tea or automobiles from Japan. We're importing, all kinds of things from China. It's hard to pick up any consumer good that isn't made in China. We're importing things from around the world, and we're paying for these things not with the sweat off our brow by producing goods and services that the rest of the world wants. We're paying for them with pieces of paper or a click on a computer mouse. And so it's allowed the United States to sort of suck the product of the rest of the world to a greater extent than we would have if we were not allowed to do this. If the rest of the world said, no, we're not going to take your dollars. You're going to have to tie those dollars to your gold reserves. We're not going to take them anymore unless you do that. Well, that means that we wouldn't be able to just print money and import Toyotas from Japan to the extent that we do, or all the goods that we get from China to the extent that we do. But again, this gets into a lot of geopolitical stuff in that, well, the automobile in China and Korea depends upon the demand from the United States. So they are masking all this themselves. They're saying, gosh, if we clamp down the United States and make them pay for their Hyundais in Korea and their Toyotas in Japan with sound money, well, they're not going to be able to buy as much, so that's going to throw some of our workers out of work. So we'll keep the ball rolling a little bit longer, and we'll just build up our reserves even a little higher. So you can see, I think, you start to get an idea of how the whole break of creating unsound money, of the unlinking of any kind of currency to a real commodity like gold or silver, causes all kinds of economic disruptions and anomalies to occur. And the biggest anomaly that has happened is the United States has become the biggest beneficiary of this, in that we're living a higher lifestyle than we would, and the rest of the world is paying for it, and they're receiving dollars that they believe are really worth something in the future, but the question is, are they really going to be worth what they think they are? And in my opinion, they're not.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.